everyone, and welcome back to Parent Academy on episode number 3, where we are talking about picky eating. And of course, we have our child expert and anxiety expert, Galina Lipkin, with us. And today we are going to be talking about what to do when kids are picky eaters and why that might be. So to jump in, what are some reasons why we might see kids become picky eaters?
So there are a lot of reasons for it. For some kids, it's just they don't like the taste of the food. For other kids, it's something related to the texture, like they don't like it because it's too slimy or because it's too crunchy. It might have a smell that they're really kind of, unhappy with. Or in other situations, kids have had kind of a scary experience with that food, either that they've choked on it or have gotten sick from it. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of makes them want to avoid that certain food.
So if they've been sick or something has happened, it's likely that they could have a secondary reaction in other ways with the same food or different foods?
Yeah, so let's say at some point a kid had choked on a carrot. Inherently, we know that carrots aren't dangerous because we eat them and they're not going to poison us. But if I choked on that carrot, I'm going to start to be afraid that every time I eat it, I'm going to choke on it, and that poses a threat to my safety. And so because our brains are so wired for survival, it's going to make me think, I need to avoid that just to make sure that I'm safe.
So the body kind of goes into a very basic, primitive concept that if I've choked once on a carrot, I shouldn't eat a carrot again because I might choke again.
Right, and of course that's not going to happen for everyone. There are some people who are going to choke on a food and say, okay, that was one experience, let's eat some more carrots. And for other people, it becomes a much more significant event where they then continue to avoid that food.
Sometimes a parent can't remember if it was associated to some sort of trauma or a scary event. What if it just came out of nowhere?
And that's totally possible too. And there are some kids who are very sensitive to just textures or smells or tastes. And so for me, maybe it's just unpleasant and I just don't like that food. But for someone else who's a lot more sensitive to some more of those sensory kind of components to food, it might be such an intolerable feeling that they really just can't even handle sitting next to that food or smelling it or eating it.
So it could cause a gag reflex, mm-hmm. for example, in somebody who is sensitive to the texture, the smell, the look of things.
Yeah, or just a really intense feeling of disgust.
Okay. And what if there's no cause and it's gradually getting worse and it's going from one thing to the next? Why is that, or what is that about?
Sometimes our brains just associate one thing with another. So it started off, let's say, with carrots, but also that night I had green beans. So maybe the green beans are dangerous too, and just that entire event becomes associated with this idea of danger. Or I don't like green beans because they're kind of slippery, or kind of slimy, so I won't eat other slimy foods. Whatever that may be. So somewhere the brain is just making associations that kind of continue to create either categories or just lists of food that the kid won't eat.
And when someone comes to see you, do they need to know where it started and why it's associated? Does the kid need to be able to articulate the history of the fear foods, or what do you need to know?
So sometimes it's helpful. Like if a kid knows that they did choke on a food, we can kind of work on that fear of choking. But if they don't know, that's okay too, because really the approach will be the same, and that's exposure to those foods that they're afraid of. And so it really, I guess at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. And how would I, if I was a parent, start to gradually have my kid eat more variety?
So it really starts with identifying what foods are kind of on that list of foods that are challenging for them. So for some kids, it might just be one food. And so you kind of work on progressively introducing that food, having it be next to their dinner, having it on their plate, smelling it, taking a bite and spitting it out, working all the way up to being able to eat it. And you can kind of do the same thing if they have a whole list of foods that they won't eat. So then going through with them and ranking them. So either a 0 to 10 scale, a 0 to 5. For little kids, I kind of use an easy, medium, hard, just because that's a little bit easier for them to conceptualize. And then working your way up the list of foods kind of the same way. So putting it next to their food, on their plate, taking a bite, and kind of moving up that way until they can just eat the food.
Okay, so for example, if we eat beef stew and my son only will eat the pieces if they're taken out of the stew and kind of cleaned up a little bit so it looks cleaner or more simple to eat. So if he has 3 pieces of cubed steak and 2 pieces of carrot on his plate that are dry and very clean and simple, but we want him to try soup, what would be the first step?
So putting just a little bit into his food, just making it, a little bit more moist than dry. And just starting there. Maybe it's not necessarily immersed in it and it's not just a bowl of stew, but maybe it's just, there's some liquid on the plate.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then we would do that a couple of times to just get him used to the idea of having liquid on his plate. And that would be a gradual exposure from it being just a dry plate with dry food, for example. And then maybe I could put that little bit of liquid with those pieces of food in a bowl. So it's the same amount of what he's already been exposed to, but in a different plate or a different bowl to kind of simulate going towards soup. Would that be kind of a good idea?
Yeah, and just kind of assessing throughout whatever scale you decide on with your child. It's, what's your number right now or what level are you at right now, and just kind of monitoring to the point where they might start at a 6 and then, after a couple times of trying it, they're like, what, this is actually a 3 for me now, so maybe we can add a little more liquid, and kind of assessing that way. So as it gets easier, we kind of want to continue to increase that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And at first, if they're resistant to it, do you try to keep them with it, or when do you kind of, quote, abandon it? When do you sort of stop the exposure and, quote, give in? Do you or do you not give in?
Typically, as long as it's a tolerable level of discomfort, the goal is to not give in. Because every time we give in and say, it's okay, you don't have to eat this, we're reteaching the brain that there is some sort of danger associated with that food, or that there's something scary or harmful about it. So unless they're having a full-blown panic attack, and we kind of know that we've surpassed their level of tolerance, we really don't want to back off on that, just because we don't want to reinforce the anxiety.
That makes sense. So start really small, get to know how they feel about things, and then gradually increase it, but we don't want to induce that panic.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So a parent has to be really patient. Mm-hmm. Really patient.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, depending on the child and depending on their level of distress tolerance, it could be a really quick process where over the course of a few days they're like, okay, I did it, let's move on. And for other kids, it might take a really long time to even just get used to one food, let alone a whole list of foods if that's the case.
And what if nutrition becomes an issue, that they're not getting enough nutrients?
Yeah, depending on how many foods the child is avoiding, it could be that they're missing an entire group of nutrients. And so it's really important to partner with pediatricians and kind of talk to them, explain what's kind of going on, and they might be able to offer supplements or some kind of nutrition replacement in the meantime as you figure out and work through some of these hierarchies. And then that way we're looking at health from a more holistic perspective, and that we're addressing the mental component and the anxiety, as well as making sure that physically nothing's kind of shifting out of place.
Yeah. And I'm going to make a little plug here that maybe someone, like a parent, could consider seeing their own nutritionist or seeing their own health coach to kind of think about what kind of groceries they're choosing, how they're shopping, how they're cooking, and maybe the parent needs more ideas. Because I know a lot of parents, and myself included, we get stuck in routines, and it's very hard to break out of our routines, and variety isn't something that busy families are very good at. So I would imagine that sometimes you recommend the parent to get services.
Sure, yeah, because there might be a nutrient that the child is missing from some of the foods that they're avoiding, and there might be a very easy replacement that they're fine with eating. So yeah, absolutely, that could be extremely helpful in this process too.
Okay. Well, that answers, I think, a lot of questions out there, so that's really helpful. And thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be back next week with episode number 4. See you guys soon.